Good morning, everybody. I'm going to read you a story this morning. The story is Curious George Gets an Oven. This is Curious George. He lives with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. George was alone this morning, looking at his picture book, when the doorbell rang. It was the mailman. "Here's a letter for you," he said. "Put it on your friend's desk. He'll read it when he comes home." George was curious. It was not often that somebody wrote him. Too bad he could not read the letter. But maybe he could write one himself. In the top drawer of the desk there was paper, ink, and a fountain pen. George sat down on the floor and began to put the pen to the paper, and it was dry. It needed ink. George would have to fill it. He got a funnel from the kitchen and started pouring ink. But instead of going into the pen, the ink spilled all over the floor and made a big blue puddle. It was an awful mess. Quickly, George got the blotter from the desk, but it was no help. The puddle grew bigger all the time. George had to think of something else. Why, soap and water. That's what I'll use to clean it up. From the kitchen shelf, he got a big box of soap powder and poured it all over the ink. Then he pulled the garden hose through the window, opened the tap, and began spraying water all over the powder. Bubbles began to form, and then some lather, and more lather, and more lather, and more lather. In no time, the whole room was full with lather. Indeed, that George had to escape in a hurry. When he was safe out of the house, first he turned off the tap. But what next? How could he get rid of all the lather before his friend comes home? George sat down in the grass and thought for a long time. Finally, he had an idea. He would get the big shovel and shovel the lather out of the window. But where was the lather? While George had begun outside thinking, it had all the time to turn into water. Now the room looked like a lake, with furniture like islands. The shovel was no use. A pump was that George needed to get the water out. And he knew where to find one. He had seen a portable pump at the farm's house down the road. The farmer was away working in his field. Nobody noticed George got the pump out of the shed. It was heavy. He would need help to pull it all the way back to the house. Maybe he could tie it to the goat. But just as George was about to slip the rope over the goat's head, he was hurled through the air and landed in a pen full of pigs. The biggest pig was standing near the gate. What if George opened the gate just enough to let them out? A big pig could easily pull the pump. Carefully, George lifted the latch, and before he knew it, all the pigs bursted out of the pen, grunting and squealing and trying to get away as fast as they could. George was delighted. He had never seen such a thing like it. For the moment, all of his troubles had been forgotten. But now the pigs were all gone, and not a single one was left to help him with the pump. Luckily, there were cows grazing nearby. Cows were gentle and strong. It would mean nothing to a cow to pull the pump for him. This time George was right. The cow did not mind being tied to the pump. So it even let him climb on her back, and off they went. George was glad. Now he would soon be home, pump out the room, and everything would be all right. Meanwhile, the farmer and his son had heard the squealing of the pigs. They rushed home from the fields, and now they had their hands full of catching all the pigs. Not until the last pig was safely back in the pen did they have time to look around. And what did they see? A little monkey riding a cow, making off with their pump. The chase was on. George and the cow were ahead at first, but the pump was slowing them down. The farmers were getting closer and closer. Now they had almost caught up with him, but where was George? He was hiding in the shirts. The farmers had run right past him, but on their way home, they had to come back over the same road. George did not feel safe in the hiding place. Just then a truck came rattling down the road. George jumped aboard. Monkeys are good at jumping, and he was gone before the farmers had a chance to see him. The truck drove to a part of town that George had never been before. At last it stopped in front of a large building. It was a museum. George did not know the museum. He was curious. While the guard was busy reading his paper, George slipped inside. He walked up the steps and into a room full of sorts of animals. At first, George was scared, but then he noticed that they weren't moving. They were not alive. They were stuffed animals put into the museum so everyone could get a good look at them. The next room, George saw something enormous, and it took his breath away. It was a dinosaur. George was not scared this time. He knew that it was not real. He looked at the dinosaur, and then the baby dinosaur, and then he saw a palm tree full of nuts. George liked nuts. He felt very hungry. He had missed lunch that day. He would climb up, and just then he heard footsteps. He had to hide again. But where? A family came in and took a look at the dinosaur. They paid no attention to the little monkey who was standing there. The monkey did not move. He stood so still. They thought he was just another stuffed animal. George was glad when they were gone. He now could pick the nuts. He climbed up the dinosaur's neck and started to pull, but the nuts would not come off. George did not know if they were not real. He pulled harder and harder. The tree began to sway. Crash! Down came the tree and the dinosaur's head. Down came the dinosaur, and down came George. Guards came rushing in from all sides, and underneath the fallen dinosaur they found a little monkey. They pulled him out and had brought him to the Professor Wiseman, who was the director at the museum. Professor Wiseman was terribly angry. "Lock that nutty monkey up right away," he said, "and take him back to the zoo. He must have ran away from there." George was carried off in a cage. He felt so ashamed he almost wished he were dead. Suddenly, the door opened. "George!" somebody shouted. It was his friend with the yellow hat. "It seems you have gotten yourself into trouble," he said. "But maybe this letter here will get you out of it. It was from Professor Wiseman. He needs your help for an experiment. I found it on my desk at home, but I couldn't find you anywhere. So I came over here to talk to the professor." And this is what the letter said. A small spaceship had been built by an experimental station. It is too small for a man, but could carry a little monkey. Would you be willing to go up in it? I have neither met you, but I've heard that you are bright and a little monkey who can do all sorts of things, and that is just what I need. We want you to do something nobody has ever done before. Bail out of the spaceship in flight. When the flash you a signal, you have to open the door and bail out with the help of the emergency rockets. We hope that you are willing and that your friend will permit you to go. Gratefully yours, Professor Wiseman, Director of the Science Museum. So you are Curious George, Professor Wiseman said. If I only knew, of course everything will be forgiven if you are willing to go. They got the smallest size spacesuit that George and all that could fit in, then helped to put him in it, and then a truck drove up and drove him off with a special television screening mounted on the watch in flight. They all got on and were off to the launch site. They checked all the controls of the spaceship, especially the lever door. George tried it too. The great moment had come. George waved goodbye and went aboard. The door was closed. Professor Wiseman began to count. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! He pressed the button and the ship rose into the air, slowly at first, and then faster and faster, and higher, until they were no longer to be seen. But on the screen they saw George clearly all the time. Now the moment had come for George to bail out. Professor Wiseman flashed the signal. They watched the screen. George did not move. Why didn't he pull the lever? In a few seconds it would be too late. The ship would be lost in outer space, and with George on it. They waited anxiously. At last George began to move, slowly, as if he in a daze. Would he reach it in time? There, he grabbed it. The door opened. Hooray! George was on his way. Out of the blue, opened a parachute. He came floating down to Earth. The truck raced over to the spot where George would land. What a welcome for George. Professor Wiseman hung a big golden medal around his neck. Because, he said, you are the first living being to come back to Earth from a space flight. And on the medal it said, to George, the first space monkey. Then a newspaper man took his picture, and everybody shouted and cheered. Even the farmer and his son, and the kind woman from next door, who had worked for hours to get the water out of the room. I am proud of you, George, said the man with the yellow hat. I guess the whole world is proud of you today. It was the happiest day in George's life. The end. Well, that was the story of Curious George Gets a Medal. I hope you enjoyed it. And the next time we talk, I will have a craft, which I hope you enjoy doing for Easter, and we'll talk then. Bye.